This day is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you could save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states. 3, 2, 1. Hello and welcome to This Day from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. It is Sunday, February 16th, and we are devoting Sundays to what we are calling Some Sunday Context, a series with thoughts on the very rocky, very history-making present that we are living in, but always trying to see what lessons history can have for us. That means that twice a month or so, we will gather in person or on Zoom on a weekend and chat about, well, what are we going to chat about? Look around, folks. That's what we're going to chat about. Here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Nice to see you on a weekend.
Good to see you, Jody.
Hey there.
Shout out to everyone who's watching this on YouTube. We are going to be posting these on YouTube, so go and subscribe there. And we may also start to do these in a way that listeners can watch live if they want and spend some time with us and ask questions and interact. So we're figuring out exactly the timing and so forth for that. But it'd be very fun to do that and sort of evolve this Sunday series. So stay tuned for information about that. We're calling it Some Sunday Context. There was a moment where I was like, should we call this Sunday Scaries?
I was just thinking that.
We should.
That could be our sort of like, ongoing rough name for it. But, I don't, look, it's scary out there. I do think history can make things maybe both more scary and less scary. But, I branding wise, I don't want to make it seem like all we're doing is getting together and being scared and being down. Though we will have some of that as well. So context over scaries, but Sunday Scaries is a good name for the series for sure. And the way that we're going to do this, I think we've talked about this before, but like we'll try and pick a theme or an angle to focus on. Obviously, there's no shortage. I mean, part of this story and the strategy for the first couple weeks of the Trump administration is to do a bunch of stuff in a bunch of different lanes. So we will, over the course of time, I think, pick a lane pick a story on DEI or the attempts to slash government spending or foreign policy stuff or political violence, and LGBT issues. All of these, I think there are stories from history. Some of them we've covered, some of them we wanted to cover that will kind of give us some grounding. Today, the slice we're going to pick is this fundamental question of executive power, executive orders, the courts, the emerging tussle between the two. And there are some really interesting moments from history that we can kind of point to. And then also, of course, get our thoughts on that right now. But before we get to that specific angle, I want to start with the same question each time. And the question is not, how was your week? Because I think I know where that will lead. But the question is, what year are you thinking about? And eventually, I'd love listeners to chime in on this too. But who wants to start with a quick riff on what year you're thinking about and why? And should we say you can't say 1968 or
We'll at least save 1968 for some time when it's a little more on the nose.
Well, this week, what year are you thinking about? Who wants to go first?
Well, I can jump in. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about 1933 and how what we're seeing is a kind of bizarro 100 days in a way, not only because Donald Trump is explicitly dismantling the New Deal state, although I think that's part of it. But, Franklin Roosevelt comes into office in the middle of a genuine national emergency. Like the banking system was on the brink of failure, probably like a couple weeks away from collapsing entirely and therefore collapsing the entire economic system in the United States and across the globe. And he had to act very, very, very fast. So he's using a lot of executive orders. He is pushing through a lot of new ideas, right? The promise he makes in his inaugural address is bold, persistent experimentation. We're going to try everything to try to solve this emergency. And yet, what does he do? He calls a special session of Congress, and he gets Congress to pass legislation. And he does it according to the rules. And then he issues executive orders to try to say, okay, well, Congress has just given the executive this new power, this new agency, and the executive order is going to determine sort of how that power gets structured. And it is a real crisis that is trying to be solved instead of a crisis being created. It is about building out state capacity to help people instead of destroying state capacity to hurt people. So I think bizarro 100 days is not a bad way to try to begin to make sense of what's happening.
And that fits really nicely into what we're going to talk about as our sort of focus for today, the mechanism by which you try and enact that kind of radical change, whether you agree with those sort of goals or not. The process is important too.
But the key thing there with FDR is that he's working with Congress. He's actually he's actually trying to say, all right, listen, all hands on deck. These are radical changes that we need to be made, and everybody needs to be on board in terms of implementing, putting all these things together and getting them executed as quickly as possible.
And to add to the bizarreness, as we've talked about a bunch on this show, FDR was also hit with accusations of being an authoritarian and a secret communist and overreaching.
And praise for potentially being a bit of a dictator, because Americans feel like we need somebody who's going to do this.
He's gotten name-checked by some MAGA world folks recently about, in a very ahistorical way, saying, oh, FDR came in and threw his weight around and issued all these executive orders. And I think to your point, Niki, that's wrong. That's not correct.
That's an incorrect reading of history.
Yeah. All right, Kellie, what year are you thinking of?
I'm thinking about 1832. I'm always taking it back to the 19th century. I'm thinking about that other Jackson that I have no relation to, Andrew Jackson. and really his executive order for Native American removal. I mean, when we think of the Trail of Tears, when we think of the removal of the Cherokee out of Georgia, this was a major Supreme Court case first. And the Supreme Court actually sided with the Cherokee Nation. The Supreme Court basically said, hey, listen, state of Georgia, you don't have any authority to move these Native American populations. And so they will stay put. And Andrew Jackson basically defied that court order. We don't know. I mean, this is kind of a apocryphal statement where it's the idea of he says, you've made your judgment, now enforce it, knowing that the president has sort of control over the troops. And that's exactly what he did. He used his executive authority to take U.S. troops and forcefully push out Native Americans from their homes and move them, relocate them further westward. And it's a grueling trail. It's a trail in which thousands of people, tens of thousands of people die, lose their lives. There is irreparable harm that happens. And it's a moment in history that really is one of the most grievous acts that is taking place under an executive order. And Andrew Jackson was seen as this person that really was a champion for the white frontiersman and was going to do his own thing and was going to dare anyone to kind of defy him. And the courts really don't have a way to combat or stand up against what he's doing.
Well, we're definitely going to talk about that tussle with the courts because I think that's sort of the theme for now, and I think has a lot to teach us or compare to what's going on with Trump now. But you're bringing it up and pointing out just the harm. It's like the courts and the executive will tussle it out, but in the interim, there's actual harm on the ground,
Actual harm, actual lives being lost.
Sort of, a tilting of the power of government in favor of some people and against others. And certainly that feels resonant now where, you can have confidence in the judicial pushback. We'll talk about whether we do. But the harm in the interim.
Mm-hmm. And there's no way to make those people whole. And I think that's something to keep in mind as well. There is damage that can be done in a fairly short amount of time that there just there's no legal remedy to. Those people have been irreparably harmed and there's no rolling it back.
No, there's no. I mean, still to this day, the Cherokee Nation does not have, power in Georgia or a place in Georgia or space in Georgia in that way. And I think oftentimes we don't realize or we don't think that presidents will actually sort of buck the system in this way. We always, I mean, we sort of rely on checks and balances and Congress having the purse and, the president having the troops and the courts being sort of the final say. And when that's not respected, when that's not protected, what sort of recourse do people have, especially when they're up against the state, especially when they're up against troops?
Yeah.
You're in a post-constitutional order at that point.
Right.
Yeah.
So I will ask that question specifically. Are we in a post-constitutional order right now? But we'll circle back to that. And I want to offer what year am I thinking of? And it doesn't really have anything to do with the courts and the executive in a showdown. But I've been thinking a little bit about 2009. By the way, notable that I think the years that we picked say a lot about us. But I'm thinking mostly about me, that I only remember 10, 15. But 2009 and the sort of rise of the Tea Party. We've done episodes about this, but in a very specific slice that I've been thinking about in this very particular moment right now. The congressional recess started yesterday on Saturday, and it goes for 1 week. And the story of, I think, a lot of political movements, but in particular, I remember the story of the Tea Party was literally congressmen, women went home, had all these town halls, and people showed up. And they got in their ear, and all of a sudden it was like, whoa, what is happening here? And yes, we could talk about the Tea Party as a sort of quote unquote astroturf thing, or a thing that was like started on cable news and was a product of the media environment. And yes, the media environment right now is very different. But, the point of planting, I'm bailing on this metaphor before I even get into it. Something about planting astroturf and the seeds or whatever. But the point is, regardless of how it started, people actually showed up and representatives got an earful. And I think in 2009 that happened over the summer more than over this break, this fall, February break. Nevertheless, there is a break happening right now, and there are efforts from Democrats, some of whom are finding a real spine right now, and some of whom are not and need to be shown where their spine is. There are efforts to show up at these town halls and to say, okay, your representative is back in your district. Democrats who are upset, Republicans who feel like they didn't vote for this, go give them an earful. And I still think there is deep power in that. And, my final thought on that is like, how do I put this? As, the demise of Twitter and the sort of corrupting of Twitter and the sort of like the way that Musk just sort of like scooped out what Twitter was 5-6 years ago. One silver lining of that, frankly, is that I think a lot of Democrats who would have, like, as they say, tweeted their way through it, and just sat home and fired off a lot of angry tweets, they don't have that space anymore, and they're picking up the phone. And maybe this week they're going to show up, And so we've talked a ton about this, about the kind of like, we need to de-internetfy our political engagement. And so maybe there's a weird twisted silver lining of the demise of Twitter as a space where you can kind of like get your angst out, that people are like actually, I think, doing that. They're making calls and they're showing up, and I'm just keeping my eye on this break in particular.
And they're showing up in interesting and varied ways. So there was a big protest outside of Stonewall yesterday, I think, because there had been an erasure of the mention of trans people at Stonewall, and even erasing the T from LGBTQ on the National Park Service website. And I think that's like people showing up. I would say the other lesson of the Tea Party is, remember how mocked it was? Yeah. Remember how it was just like dismissed, and it just kept going and going, and it cost the Republican seats in 2010 and 2012 and 2014, and they won in the end. And I think that Democrats and liberals and protesters should have a bit of a spine, and also worry a little bit less about being ridiculed, because of course you're going to be ridiculed, and just continue to make clear what your values are, what your message is, what you will support and what you won't support.
For sure.
Yeah. That's, if anything is encouraging me in this moment, it's the people that are like 10 toes down. The people are like, oh no, we are not going to stand for this. And orders be damned. Like, this is what we are doing. This is what we believe. And like, I love that refusal. Can I just say, I love that.
Yeah.
I love the we refuse mantra. I love the idea of just people just sort of like standing their ground and being willing to, defend the principles they believe in.
I love the idea of being 10 toes down as opposed to 10 fingers typing or whatever,
Yes.
some little phrase there, but yeah.
Yes.
His 10 toes are touching grass.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The Stonewall thing was remarkable. There is, I was reading that, I think the phrase is decoupling, but basically there's a strategy to, if we have LGB, it used to be LGB and now it's like LGBTQIA plus, I think is the sort of extent to that the acronym could go and has gone. But there's like a specific attempt to kind of roll back letter by letter, decouple that,
Yes.
and, pit groups that should have solidarity against each other. And that is like there's been, I think I read an article yesterday that pointed to like a particular memo from a, anti-LGBT group a few years ago that said like, this is a strategy, pick off the T. They're not going to stop at the T, right? They're going to then go to the, and so I had the solidarity shown there. And, obviously the historical fact that people like Marsha Jackson, who we've done an episode on, were part of standing on the front lines at Stonewall. If they come for the park in Williamsburg named after her, I think there will be some big protests too.
Oh, no question. No question. I even think that there is dissension among the ranks among conservatives. I mean, it's so interesting. Do you guys remember this? We did, this was like another live taping that we did where we had, I was telling you about how someone in my town, which is relatively blue, had like a ginormous Trump billboard like in their front yard, like literally billboard size. And it came down a couple weeks ago. And I was like, that's interesting because I drive by it like all the time and I was like, oh God. And I noticed that it's down and all the little other like sort of accoutrement is down as well. And I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
Why? I don't know, but
sign doesn't go up or a Tesla.
That's right.
And I mean,
but it's there's some rumblings too as well.
Yeah, and we'll get to over the course of our Sunday Scaries series, we'll get to the ways in which I think certainly the economic picture is a huge front. I think the like legal showdown, which we'll talk about right now, is a huge front. A quick word about Up First from NPR. Breaking news, as you've probably noticed, is pretty broken. You're constantly doom scrolling on Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, or X, or whatever we're calling it, and maybe you feel a little bit of, I'm over it, I'm over the news. Well, if this sounds like you, I recommend that you listen to the Up First podcast from NPR. You get everything you need to know in an easy 15-minute update. Look, if you listen to this show, it is very likely that you follow the news and you care about politics, just like me. But I think one of the best choices you can make is decide how to engage with the news. And Up First is a perfect way to distill down to just the information you need to help you understand the news without getting overwhelmed and feeling that sense of news paralysis. Up First is national and international. There's facts and information, but there's also personality and analysis. Start your day every day with Up First. Change the way that you consume the news. Listen now to the Up First podcast from NPR. This day is brought to you by Quince. Now, who doesn't love the good things in life? And even though I enjoy a little luxury, it doesn't mean I can always afford it. But Quince is here to help. Quince has become my go-to for luxury essentials at affordable prices. I know we're all shivering right now, but I'm already thinking about spring and summer and refreshing my wardrobe a bit. So I'm on the Quince website right now looking at some stuff. Oh, another pair of linen pants. I have a pair of those already, but maybe a different color. There's sunglasses here I'm looking at. An organic cotton silk button-down polo sweater. If you see me rocking that this spring, please compliment it. It's very nice looking. And the best part of it all is that Quince items are priced 50 to 80% less than similar brands. You can get 100% Mongolian cashmere sweaters for $50, shorts, t-shirts. You can even get 14-karat gold jewelry. So now's the time. Treat yourself, restock, look good, give yourself the luxury you deserve with Quince. Go to quince.com/thisday for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/thisday to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/thisday. Okay, so our specific topic and our specific slice for today will be kind of a little historical perspective on this idea of legal constraints. And we have Trump circumventing a lot of legal constraints, defying court orders, potentially ignoring funding mandates. And there are things that history can teach us. In a bigger sense, though, before we get to that, Niki, I'm curious just like if you can lay out what you're thinking about Trump of it all and the Musk of it all, because I think there have been kind of two phases to this blitz. And, I think I said this on the show, but like, those first 24 hours where Trump just wanted to sign a ton of executive orders and pull out his Sharpie, I think that's largely what he is in it for, right? He likes the theater of that. And obviously there was some policy and some fallout of that. But then we have the Musk efforts. And it's, I think, a big question of like, how coordinated are they? How much is Musk sort of acting from a mandate? So how do you disassociate those two in particular? Like when we talk about the showdown between the executive and the courts, is it pushback against these executive orders, or is it pushback against, the rat fucking that Musk is up to?
Well, it's both, because they're both related. I mean, it is true that Trump has sort of like given the keys of the country over to Musk to go in and begin ordering the firing of people, to begin shutting down computer systems, locking them out. And part of that is because Musk has people on board who can shut off your computer access, right? That's not something that Donald Trump would be able to do. And Donald Trump isn't interested in the nitty gritty. What Donald Trump wants is he wants to be seen as being very active and bold and strong man kind of leader. And he wants vengeance. And to the extent that he has levers to pull to get those things, he's pulling those levers. Musk is trying to replicate what he did at Twitter, right? To make the government lean, to come in and break things and to show that you don't actually need this much state capacity. All you really need is a really slimmed down government that is then, to the extent that it's refilled, is refilled with Trump supporters and people who are on board with the MAGA agenda. The context for all of this, though, the thing that binds what Musk is doing with what Trump is doing, I feel crazy saying, like, this is Project 2025. They have an agenda. They wrote it all down. It's in a 900-page document. They are going step by step and doing it, except sometimes when Project 2025 says, get Congress to do X, they're like, nah, we're just going to smash through that anyway. And the idea being that, like, by the time anyone tries to stop us, it's all going to be broken anyway. You're not going to be able to fix it. And that's what they're doing. And the thing is, it is shock and awe. Right? It is coming in fast. It's smashing as much stuff as possible. And I saw a little bit of pushback. I think maybe Amy Walters was like, well, it's not shock and awe because they told us they were going to do this during the campaign. But it's like, I was watching CNN when they were doing shock and awe in the Iraq War, and we all knew it was coming. We knew exactly what was going to happen. There was a countdown clock on CNN. The shock and awe is just the massive destruction. And we were promised that. Now we're getting it.
And the brazenness of it, too, because Musk is also like, so we lied. So we got some things wrong. We're going to, whatever. Like, there's no, it's completely unapologetic. And, and of course, all of the influence that he has. I keep thinking of like the quote in Mean Girls where it's like, you don't even go to this school. Like, I keep thinking about that with myself. You're not even American. Like, it just is mind boggling to me. But also, I have a student who is South African, and she's just like, the idea that Black South Africans own 3% of their country, 3%. And, this idea of Trump and Musk putting sanctions against South Africa because they're trying to recoup so much of the land that was stolen through colonialism. It's not just something where Musk is having influence in our own country, but also in other policies and other sanctions that are happening against South Africa. For any attempts to sort of repair the harm and the violence of colonialism is just, it's again wild behavior. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, you cannot run, we've said this over again, you cannot run a country like a business. You absolutely can't. Like, there are aspects of bureaucracy that are absolutely necessary in order for society to function at a large scale. And the idea of winnowing all that down, taking an agency that has thousands of people and now saying, okay, maybe, a couple hundred or maybe several dozen will run it, is just makes no sense.
Yeah. And the point of the government isn't to make shareholders happy.
Exactly.
Yes.
Like, they're different things. They're different purposes.
They're two totally different things.
I know that this isn't entirely the point of this conversation, but I mean, I do think making white South Afrikaners refugees, giving them refugee status, sanctioning South Africa, J.D. Vance meeting with Alternative for Deutschland. There's also this other component of it, which it is preserving state capacity or using state capacity in order to create a white supremacist state, like an explicitly one, right?
Yes,
like the destruction of DEI, the covering of pictures of women and Black people, the erasure of non-white people from history, like. It's so blatant what's happening. Yes. And my frustration, I think, is that we're not just constantly saying it because it, again, sounds a little crazy when you say it, but it's so explicit and it's so public.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and, and even to your point about dismantling state capacity in some regards, but then, SpaceX still gets a nice little $400 million grant in the midst of all this, or whatever it was.
Zero for cancer, $400 million for Musk.
Definitely want to add kind of this question of like, are we all living in the wake of the grievances of apartheid to our list of sort of things to puzzle through. It's really fascinating. Okay, let's go a little to the specific questions of the sort of constraints on the executive, the constraints on whatever you want to call someone like Elon Musk, who is acting, I suppose, on behalf of the executive, and, whether what the courts can do as pushback, what public opinion can do as pushback, what elected representatives can do as pushback, and what norms should do or have done as pushback. So we've laid out the contours a little bit of this, that there's certain things that an executive can do through executive power, but, the enforcement of that often relies on norms. And then when it comes to budgetary issues and agencies and just trying to dismantle agencies or hollow out agencies, that has tended to run through the legislature. And so that is what is sort of leading to the majority of these court orders, is that this is not necessarily on paper the purview of the executive.
That paper being the Constitution.
That paper being the Constitution. Yeah. There have been a few moments in the past where this has been tested. I'm not trying to say that this is perfectly analogous, but we did. Let's go in order. We did talk about Andrew Jackson and the Supreme Court, 1832. Jackson wants to remove Cherokee from Georgia. As you said, Kellie, the courts ruled against that. And then there is this apocryphal potentially saying, but basically Jackson says, John Marshall, who's the head of the Supreme Court, as Chief Justice, John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it, which is basically like, bring it. Let's see what happens when the courts go against me. The interesting thing to me about that story, right, is that this is it Worcester or Worcester versus
Worcester?
Georgia? Worcester, yeah, that's how you pronounce Worcester, right?
Yeah.
So it's this Worcester versus Georgia ruling. I think the court knew that it was headed towards a constitutional crisis if it issued this ruling and tried to compel Jackson to stop, and Jackson refused to comply. Then it just brings up this question that we're right on the brink of right now, which is what now? And so the court actually, I don't know if you call it, you tell me, you're the historians, they don't blink necessarily, but they kind of issue their ruling in a way that gives Jackson a little bit of an out so that it doesn't really lead to a very clear constitutional crisis. But they basically say, like, you don't have authority to do this, but they don't sort of mandate action and say, do this or stop doing this. What do you make of that parsing? Does it feel like something that is in the mix now about is it going to be incumbent upon the courts themselves to like rein in the leash on Trump while also saying, gosh, if we actually take this stand and he pushes back, then we're in territory that we're not so comfortable with? Maybe we're already in that territory. I don't know.
I think we're already in that territory we're not comfortable with. I mean, I think the courts have been sort of a vanguard in standing up to a lot of these orders. And at the same time, I get the sense that they are also a little skittish about what happens when their orders are not respected, when their orders are not listened to or abided by. And I don't think they fully understand their own authority to push back in that way and what that would look like and sort of what that would entail, because it's not as though the courts can sort of, weaponize the troops or state or the police or,
send the National Guard to the White House and give
and you're not going to arrest the president. You're not going to put him in contempt. Like how does that, what does that look like? And that's where you get like, honestly, a constitutional crisis, because it's like, well, how then do you rein in the president? If the Supreme Court has given him all of this authority and all of this power, then who checks him? Then how do we sort of keep balance? And that's why people are so concerned, because that sort of unilateral authority means no one really has the power to stop or intervene.
I also think this kind of fear of a constitutional crisis, we should push on it some. Like, the constitutional crisis isn't the worst thing that could happen. Ethnic cleansing is worse than a constitutional crisis. So the Supreme Court pulls its punches to avoid a constitutional crisis, but what's the end result? It's the Trail of Tears. Yeah. And I think that that's what we're kind of hurtling toward here now, which is, are people going to try to sidestep forcing the issue, making it clear? Because it's already happening. But are people going to sidestep sort of the reckoning in order to protect us from a clear constitutional crisis? And what is that going to allow? And I think that the Jackson example is a good example of like, why? What's your Constitution worth if this is what it allows?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and to me, that's where you kind of have to you can't disaggregate all the players in all of this, right? It's not just the courts and the presidency, but it's also Congress and public opinion and so forth. And so, you walk up to the brink of a constitutional crisis, but then, it's on the other people who have power to exert their power and point that out. And, and I don't want to use the phrase take advantage of that, but like, point it out for what it is, to stand up for what they believe in. And so, I take your point, Niki, like, these things are all on paper, and it's just about what real humans then do in the wake of it, right?
Yeah, how does it play out?
How does it actually play out? And so you can I think that's where the public pressure on elected officials, and I think that's Democrats, I think a lot of Democratic elected officials have pointed out that they don't have any actual kind of concrete power at the moment, but they certainly have the voice. And in a moment like this, there's my cat in the background. At a love the constitutional crisis. At a moment like this, where you're handed this opportunity, an awful opportunity, but to really rally and to sort of really be forceful in your language. And I think, Kellie, something you said earlier about the sort of way that Trump is acting and being brazen, and just sort of, and Musk is acting and being brazen and just doing whatever they want and saying, I don't care what anyone else, I don't care about court orders, I don't care. So two things. One is, Ezra Klein wrote a piece this week where he was basically like, they can do all that stuff, but they're also trying to tell a story. I got to get rid of this cat. Hold on. All up in the bench. Sorry, kid. They can try and tell a story about their power, And you should take the action seriously and push back against them. But the story you don't have to believe, right? I think was Dr. Klein's point. Right? The story that they can do it all and that they have a mandate is actually not true. And it's a choice to whether sort of decide to take that on faith and fight on those grounds, or you can just say, no, I actually don't believe you. I don't believe that most Americans want this. I don't believe that you have this power. So try it, do your thing. We'll fight it. But the larger narrative doesn't have to be a given.
And enforcement is actually a little bit more complicated and difficult than people think it is. I mean, the Trail of Tears is an incident in which enforcement was very much there, but and very hard to defy. But I think even today, because of the way that the country works, trying to enforce certain things are not going to be as easy said as they are, as easily done as they are said. Yeah. And so, I mean, we talk about this in the classroom. You can say like, don't teach X, but unless you're putting cameras in every single classroom and, filling out reports, and, people are going to do what they're going to do in their own classrooms. They're always going to have autonomy. You're not going to be able to sort of like enforce in that way that you think you can. There's not enough policing forces to be able to even do that. There's not enough time. There's not enough resources.
And that's where you get norms and sort of self-policing and the sort of obeying in advance. It's complying in advance, all that stuff. Niki, thoughts here? And then actually, as you share those thoughts, I also want to ask you, like, do you feel like, where is your gauge of like whether we can say the Trump folks are going to defy these orders? It's a little hard for me at this particular moment to figure out exactly that.
I don't think we know. I mean, I do think that there will be a push comes to shove moment. Like they're going to pick the battle that they really want to push hard on. I think right now they're testing the boundaries. They're like, well, who is going to push back against us? Because you can actually like
in Jurassic Park.
Exactly. Honestly, exactly like that.
Yes.
And I think that there are some fences that are down, and that's going to be an issue. I think the thing that I struggle with in thinking about like the role of the courts here is that we're seeing a lot of courts zap the Trump administration as it runs against these electric fences. But I'm wary of us being too like, the courts are the final say on all of this, because these things are going to go to the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
A illegitimate body that is going to hand down some rulings. And this is where it like matters that you know what your values are. And it matters that you understand the stage of crisis that we are in. Because if you just sort of like roll back to, well, we got to follow what the courts say, and the courts start ruling that it is okay to engage in trans eliminationism, that it is okay to tell schools that they can't teach Black history. Like when the court starts handing down these immoral rulings, what are you going to do?
What are you going to do?
And I think it's like, again, we don't need to say in advance that the Supreme Court has all of this power and that the president has all of this power. I think it's recognizing that these illegitimate uses of power are going to happen.
Yeah.
And so what is your argument for when they do, and what are you going to do when they do? And to not just like do this kind of wish casting that the Supreme Court is going to stop all of this from happening, because they're not.
And, we've, I think our conversation here is reflective of the way in which a lot of this is playing out, in that our conversation has been so focused on Trump and the courts and a little bit on public opinion, and largely absent in our conversation has been Congress, right? Which not just Democrats in Congress, but Republicans in Congress, by all rights, could be standing up and say, wait a minute, some of this belongs to us. Some of this should, and it's not a norm. It's in the Constitution, flows through us. The power of the purse. As agencies are established by Congress, they should only be dismantled by Congress. So there is a moment from history that is sort of reflective of this. And so let's go to January 1973 as we start to wrap up here. January 1973, we have Richard Nixon versus the Office of Economic Opportunity, OEO. He'd pledged to dismantle this going back several years. In 1968, when he was running for office, he wanted to sort of get rid of the OEO. which was created under Johnson as part of the sort of war on poverty. And he tries through basically executive order to take unilateral action and get rid of it. He tries to appoint, I mean, so many, so this sounds very familiar. He appoints a sort of interim acting executive who then starts to gut it from the inside. And then there is pushback. And some of the pushback is very similar to what we've seen now. And federal employees and the employees union start to fight back. There's protests. People don't comply with these orders. A judge rules that it's, quote, unauthorized by law, illegal, and in excess of statutory authority to try and dismantle the OEO through executive action. And it's basically the court ruling says, look, these were created by congressional statute. Only Congress can eliminate them. So I think that's the story that feels very similar and walks right up to the brink of what would happen now. And the thing that happens in 1973 that I think is very interesting is that then Congress itself is activated and says, yeah, you know what? You're right. Like, this is on us. Like, this is up to us. This has to flow through us. And Nixon kind of largely, decides that's the game that's being played and kind of defers to that. But anyway, any lessons there from the sort of OEO versus Nixon showdown that you're thinking about right now?
One thing that I think about, in addition to, it's the Office of Economic Opportunity that they're trying to dismantle. Nixon was feeling himself after the 1972 election, and he thought he could do this. So he's throwing his power around, and he is facing a Democratic Congress. And a Democratic Congress is going to stand up to Nixon and does stand up to Nixon repeatedly throughout this period, is going to pass laws that begin to challenge this usurpation of executive authority that had been happening over, frankly, decades, where they passed the War Powers Act, they passed the Impoundment Act. They're like, you have to spend the money that we allocate. They point to the Reorganization Act that's like, you can't organize these agencies out of existence if Congress has constructed them. Like, that's what we do. And that idea that Congress jealously guards its prerogatives, the whole notion of checks and balances, which are largely metaphorical, is based on this idea that people are going to hold fast to their power, that they're going to engage in turf wars.
Yeah.
And, with the OEO, what's interesting is Nixon's got a lot on his plate in 73. He backs off of this. But Reagan, when he gets into office, he has a Republican Congress and he gets rid of the OEO.
Yeah.
What is fascinating about the moment that we're in, Trump has a Republican Congress.
Yeah.
He doesn't give a shit.
Yes.
No, he doesn't.
I tried to find this, and it's a little hard to find this. Maybe it's because the website got taken down by Doge or something. But has Trump brought a single bill to kind of before this Congress that he controls to try and enact some of these reforms?
No,
my God.
No, that's the craziest thing about all of this is that if you your party controls,
they would rubber stamp the crap out of most of this stuff. Right?
Could actually be a lot easily accomplished if he wanted to do it through proper channels. Yeah. If he actually wanted to do that, but he's not. He's not going to them. He's not. I actually don't think that he. I actually don't think he really respects them. I think he sees them as sort of like, okay, yeah, I've got power, but I would have the power whether I had it or not. So it doesn't matter. I don't think he wants to refer or defer to them for anything. And that's what's so mind-boggling and almost like a backward saving grace in some sense that he hasn't employed them to do his bidding. But he easily could.
Yeah, I think Congress doesn't want the responsibility for it either. So they're happy with the arrangement. But I have two thoughts on this. One, it is the case that Republicans don't have 60 members in Congress or in the Senate. And so if they tried to pass some of these bills, it would almost certainly be filibustered by Democrats, and then they would have to get rid of the filibuster. So there's a thing that would have to happen there. Yeah. They are working on putting together this kind of omnibus reconciliation bill. Because you can pass one or two reconciliation bills that sidestep the requirement for 60 votes to get cloture. And so can't be filibustered, right? And they could pack a lot of this stuff into it. But what's so fascinating about that is they haven't, right? The destruction of these agencies is continuing apace, even without Congress acting. So they might decide at the end of the day, these agencies have been destroyed. Like, we don't need to formally get rid of them. That would be unpopular to get rid of the Department of Education. So we don't have to do this. And then again, you have a constitutional crisis. You have a president who is using an extraordinary amount of power that he does not have. And Congress is just like, that's fine.
Yeah.
And,
whatever.
You know, that budget, there's other podcasts where you can get into the weeds on the sort of looming budget fight for sure. But I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that there's a lot of speculation, a lot of pressure about whether that is the actual sort of concrete fight that Democrats can really sort of take a stand on. And, you know, I think the bigger question is, you know, how much do we trust them to be strategic? And then, you know, if they're not showing a ton of spine now, is that because they're withholding their spine for the right strategic moment, which just feels like
spine is a renewable resource.
I know.
You use it and you get more and it gets stronger. You don't use it and it just sort of wastes away.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
So I think that's right. The one other thing about the OEO versus Nixon fight, we've talked a lot about, you know, the Nixon era, as rocky as it was. You know, Nixon's attempts at overreach led to a lot of concrete reforms, right? And so you have like these post-Nixon reform efforts, starting with this moment, you know, and there's and I just think it's notable that like it sort of flew a little under the radar, but a lot of the first things that the Trump administration tried to do when it first arrived was just like take away some of those post-Nixon reforms. You know, it's like, oh, I don't want to be living in 1977. I want to be living in 1972. You know, and so like the Reorganization Act, which is the thing that wrapped Nixon's knuckles in this particular instance. I think the Trump folks tried to roll that back or go after that. I don't know.
And they're going after like the ethics law that's passed in 1978. It establishes an independent counsel. Obviously, they're getting rid of that. But all of those IG offices, the Inspector General's offices that provide oversight, all of the ethics rules that are put in place, all of the like not taking bribes from foreign governments, like all of those different things that are put in place in the 1970s are just being stripped away. And I'm working on a book on this, but like it's been winnowed away for quite some time. Sure. Like it was not in the best shape to begin with when Trump took office. But it's a reminder why Watergate, though I'm sure we're going to be talking about it a ton, is an insufficient analogy for this moment. You have a Congress willing to stand up to Nixon. You have impeachment as a live threat out there. All of these things that are supposed to constrain the president, constrained Nixon in certain ways. And essentially none of those exist with any real power at the moment. So we're going to have to get a little bit more creative than returning to Watergate analogies.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
All right, let's wrap this thing up. This has been really fascinating, and obviously there is no shortage of directions this could go. But listeners, you know, we really want to hear from you your thoughts on kind of particular angles and slices that we should take on as stories arise, and historical moments can offer some context, if not parallels. I also want to hear what year you're thinking of, so let's do that. And maybe in the newsletter, we'll sort of start to do polls or Q&As around that. But tell us, what year are you thinking of and why? And you can't say 1968. They might be running out of years that you can't say, given the sort of omni-shambles that we're seeing around us. Final thing, if you have one, you don't have to, but you know, is there something that you are reading, studying, using to distract yourself? You mentioned Watergate, Niki. In the mail this morning arrived this book, The Time of Illusion by Jonathan Schell. Which I've never read.
You're taking me back to grad school in Orals.
I haven't read it. I was only able to find a used it doesn't exist in digital or audiobook. I was only able to find a used copy online for $3. Jonathan Schell actually taught at Wesleyan when I was there. But I don't know. I'm sure, Niki, you're sort of in the world of this as you're writing. But my understanding of this book, and I'm very excited to read it, is it's a little less. It's obviously about Watergate and the Nixon era, but I think it's a lot about like the experience of living through the Nixon era, which I'm very excited to read about. And that I think is, I take your point, Niki, about like, you know, we don't have those parallels one-to-one anymore, but I think the sort of, Schell's a great writer, and like the experience of what it's like to live in this sort of weird reality is sort of something that I'm looking forward to. So that's just arrived this morning, but I'm going to read The Time of Illusion by Jonathan Shell, and I'll report back on how that's going.
I don't know if I should say what I'm reading because I feel shame. Like I'm reading about like fairies right now.
Yeah, great.
Girl, same. I've read so much fiction.
Like Sarah Moss has this whole series about like fairies and they're fighting and having sex, and I'm here for it. Like I need to check out, possibly because I'm teaching Black women's history now. We just finished Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Like we're doing like the origins of the field of gynecology next week, and like I cannot take anything nonfiction. So give me a fighting fairy who's in love, and I'm all for it.
The good news is Sarah Moss has like 5 or 6 different series, and they all have like 5 or 7 books in them. So you are set, I think, at least for the first year of the Trump administration.
Oh, for sure.
I, too, have been reading a ton of romantasy, which is this kind of genre that she is operating in. And it is balm for the soul because all of my other reading, I mean, I'm teaching a class on U.S. political history. And it's a tough slog because you have to sort of like question all of your priors now that you thought about like a democracy and law and all these different things. And so that's pretty tough. But I also like, I'm working on this book about governmental impunity and the way that the right has seized power and rerouted power toward themselves over the past 50 years or so. And it's work, right? But I actually do find real value in doing the work right now. It's not as immediate as like constantly writing op-eds or constantly being on social media, but it does feel like a time to find something big and enduring to work on. Like if you have work that is about what's happening at the moment, or work that speaks to your values. Maybe it has nothing to do with politics, but it's about your values. That now is the time for enduring things instead of ephemeral things. And I'm finding, as tough as it is sometimes and as depressing as it is sometimes, that I find a real joy and a real kind of rejuvenation in doing something big and enduring.
I love that.
I agree.
That is a great final note to end on. Listeners, thank you to everyone who's listening. Thank you to everyone who is watching. And we will continue to see you on Sundays for a little context. That's it. Have a good weekend, everyone. Dr. Kohlheimer, thanks as always. Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
Thanks, Jody.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia from PRX.